It's the summer of 1942, and a series of explosions rips through aluminum plants in New York, Illinois, and Tennessee. Another explosion cripples a hydroelectric plant in Niagara Falls, and yet another hits Newark's Penn Station in New Jersey during the morning commute. All across America, people are shocked and afraid. America's once mighty industrial machine slowly grinds to a halt. The unthinkable has happened. German spies have come to American shores, and they brought the terror of the distant war with them. Now, if you're scratching your head here and wondering why you haven't heard about these attacks before, it's because they never occurred. At least not outside of Adolf Hitler's fevered imagination. This is the story of Germany's bungled plot to sabotage America. So, even before America entered the war, German spies had been scouting and mapping the US for potential targets. And when Hitler decided that he wanted to use this information to send in teams to start blowing things up, he turned to the WWII, Germany's military intelligence, to make it happen. Lieutenant Walter Kapp, a former resident of Chicago, was put in charge of the operation. The heart of the plan was pretty straightforward. On paper anyway. The saboteurs were to strike blows that would cripple the very thing that made America such a threat in the war, its production capability. The chief targets would be things like aluminum and magnesium plants, power plants, train stations, railroad tracks, locks, and bridges. In fact, if all went according to plan, Germany would sneak teams onto American shores every 4 to 6 weeks, and these attacks would continue for years. Now, in order to pull off such a daring adventure on foreign soil, Kapp would need highly skilled operatives. Men who could fight and perhaps even kill if confronted, and who could stand up under intense interrogation if captured. He would need men with nerves of steel. And given the importance of the operation, Kapp could presumably have any of the men he chose. But instead of trained saboteurs, the primary requirement for the job seemed to be that the men had a familiarity with America. In fact, all of the recruits selected for the operation had lived in America for at least a short while, and 2 of them were actually American citizens. None, however, were trained in espionage. So the men were sent to a training ground outside of Brandenburg, Germany to attend sabotage school. Never mind that putting the men together at one location meant that if captured, each man could identify the others. That part of the plan was so short-sighted that even the head of the Abwehr, Wilhelm Canaris, called it pure madness. But that was just the start. At the camp, the men were given intensives in martial arts, chemistry, incendiaries, bomb making, and secret writing. They learned how to shoot, to read maps, to destroy electric poles, to identify weaknesses in industrial facilities, and they were versed in their carefully crafted cover stories. In other words, they were given exactly the sort of training one would expect a saboteur to receive, and they absorbed all they could in their 3 weeks of training. The team was then sent off to France to await the U-boats that would take them to the United States. And this is where things really started to fall apart.
Among the equipment they carried with them were blocks of TNT, some of which were disguised to look like lumps of coal.
Along with explosives, fake documents, and American clothes, the men were supplied with $175,200 in American bills, over $3.5 million today. There was just one problem. A sizable chunk of the cash they were given was in bills that were no longer in circulation in the US. That meant the saboteurs had to get much of their cash exchanged at banks in order to use it. While still in Paris, one of the conspirators made a very public announcement at a bar that he was a secret spy on his way to cause chaos in America. Another guy decided to dispute his bill with a sex worker, and that got the local authorities on his case. Still, another contracted a severe case of gonorrhea and had to leave the project altogether. But if you thought that it was just the inexperienced guys screwing up, George Dash, the supposed point man for the operation, left all of the trip's documentation on a train. Anyone discovering them would have known all about the diabolical plans. It was only blind luck that they were not discovered. And again, this was all before they even left Europe.
On May 26 and 28, 1942, 2 German submarines left the base at Lorient.
So with the team culled down to just 8, the men were split into 2 teams and sent off on their journey to the United States, with the first team led by Dash heading to New York, and the second team, led by a man named Edward Curling, sent to land on the coast of Florida. The first team arrived near East Hampton on Long Island on the night of June 12th, and it was anything but a smooth arrival. It was an extremely foggy night, which on one hand gave the saboteurs cover, but on the other hand it made navigation difficult. So much so that the U-boat carrying the men got hung up on a sandbar 100 yards offshore. The team had to cross the last 100 yards in a rubber dinghy piloted by several German sailors. And then, as the rest of the team was stumbling around trying to find a place to bury their 4 cases of explosives, their team leader George Dash stepped away to reconnoiter the beach. and as he crossed over a dune, he stepped right into the path of a patrolling Coast Guardsman named John C. Cullen. Dash then spent several minutes trying to convince Cullen that he was part of a group of fishermen, but when another team member came out of the fog and addressed Cullen in German, Dash had to give up the ruse. He told Cullen that he didn't want to kill him and offered him $260 to forget he had seen the men. Once he was out of sight of the men, he ran back to his station and reported what he had seen. When he returned with his fellow guardsmen, the saboteurs and the U-boat were gone. However, footprints and a discarded shovel led the Coast Guard to a stash of explosives and equipment buried in the sand. And so it was that within 12 hours of their landing, the entirety of this crack team's explosives and equipment was in the hands of the FBI, and one of the largest manhunts in the Bureau's history was underway. There was just one problem. The FBI had zero leads as to who these men were and where they were headed. But that would all change thanks once again to the very man in charge, George Dash. Because, as it turns out, Dash had no intention of carrying out attacks on America. In fact, if Dash and his teammate and co-conspirator Ernest Berger are to be believed, they both deeply despised the German government and had only volunteered for the job in order to make it back to the States. So after arriving at their hotel in New York, the men decided to turn themselves in to the FBI and give up the rest of their fellow saboteurs. And if that wasn't enough, they would then volunteer to return to Germany on a mission to kill Heinrich Himmler. Dash picked up the phone to call the FBI, and this is where things get a little he said, she said. On the one hand, the FBI claims that they were definitely 100% right on top of things when Dash made his phone call, and they took it very seriously. On the other hand, Dash says that when he initially reached out to the FBI and informed them that he was a German spy, the agent he spoke with responded with, yes, Napoleon called yesterday," and then hung up. Undeterred, Dash decided that the only way to convince the FBI that he was the real deal was to head down to Washington, D.C., track down J. Edgar Hoover himself, and hand over the suitcase full of German-supplied American dollars as proof.
Remember always that the spy and the saboteur or the destroyer carries no badge. He pretends innocence.
Ironically, the very day that Dash made it to D.C., the second team of saboteurs arrived in Ponte Vedra, Florida. Their arrival was much less dramatic than that of their compatriots. After coming ashore under the cover of darkness, the four men changed into civilian clothes, buried their supplies, and caught trains to Chicago and Cincinnati. As the Florida team was making their way north, Dash walked into FBI headquarters. And after overcoming yet another agent's skepticism by dumping out his suitcase full of German-supplied money onto a table, he laid out the entirety of the saboteurs' plans. Dash's interview lasted more than 13 hours and produced a document 254 pages long. Now, the FBI had Ernest Berger under surveillance in New York even before Dash had finished his interview. Berger led agents to the other saboteurs, and the three men were quickly arrested. With the New York team now out of play, J. Edgar Hoover fired off a memo to President Roosevelt informing him of the FBI's accomplishments and assuring him that the other saboteurs would be apprehended very shortly. No mention was made of Dash or the role he played in bringing down the German scheme, or even the Coast Guard's involvement, and Roosevelt was left with the very real impression that the FBI and Hoover himself had heroically spoiled the plot all on their own. In fact, FDR's Attorney General, Francis Biddle, would later explain in his memoirs, it was generally concluded that a particularly brilliant FBI agent, probably attending the school in sabotage where the eight had been trained, had been able to get on the inside and make regular reports to America. This, of course, was far from the truth.
That is only part of the story. Some of it is still secret. But we have a report which up until now has been known only to the highest officials of our government.
The FBI was also not assured of rounding up the second team of saboteurs either. All Dash was able to tell the agents was that the German teams were meant to meet up in Cincinnati on July 4th. As to where they were before then, he didn't know. But he did have a handkerchief with a top-secret list of German contacts in America the saboteurs could contact if they needed help. The only problem there was that Dash could not recall the method used to expose the invisible ink. He'd apparently not paid too much attention to that part of his training. After extensive experimentation, however, the FBI discovered that using ammonia made the names legible. All the contacts on the list were immediately put under surveillance, and when Edward Curling showed up at one of the contacts' addresses, the FBI followed him to another member of the team and arrested them both. As for the final two members of the team, they were arrested only after another member of the team, Herbert Haupt, walked into the offices of the FBI. Like Dash, it seemed Haupt had no intention of carrying through with his mission, and when he found himself stateside with a wad of cash and instructions to start blowing things up, he didn't do that at all. Instead, he confessed everything to his parents, bought a new car with the money he'd been given, and proposed to his girlfriend. And then he went to the FBI to apologize for not registering for the US draft. By that time, of course, the FBI was already on to Haupt, and after his arrest, Haupt's confession led them to the final member of the team at a nearby movie theater.
We of the FBI feel that we're a part of a team to make America a great and decent place in which to live.
And now, with all the German spies in hand, there was then the question of what exactly should be done with them. None of these would-be saboteurs had actually carried out any attacks on American targets, and there was at least some indication that some of them never intended to in the first place. There were even fears that the evidence against them was so thin that the charges might not even stick, at least not in a civilian court of law. Another danger with trying the men in a civilian court was that Dash's testimony would almost certainly reveal the role he played in bringing the plot to an end. Not only would this undermine the FBI's reputation, but it would reveal to the public just how easily 2 German U-boats slipped in and out of American waters undetected. And according to Professor Douglas O'Linder at UMKC School of Law, FDR saw this case as similar to that of the Revolutionary War case against British Major John Andre, who had helped Benedict Arnold in his treason against the US. John Andre had been hanged for his crime, and FDR felt the death penalty was almost obligatory in this case as well. A message must be sent to American enemies that such action would not be tolerated. So on July 2nd, President Roosevelt ordered that a military tribunal be set up to try the men. The tribunal lasted for several weeks, and after 2 days of deliberation, all 8 men were found guilty. And despite a plea from their defense attorneys stating that they did not hurt anybody, they did not blow up anything, all 8 men were given the sentence of death. Appeals for leniency from both J. Edgar Hoover and Attorney General Francis Biddle led to George Dash and Ernest Berger having their sentences commuted to 30 years and life in prison, respectively. Then, on August 8th, 5 days after the sentences were handed down, the other 6 would-be saboteurs were executed by the electric chair. The case was almost immediately controversial, and within months, military law experts found that quite a bit of what took place during the trial went against wartime laws. But it does seem the message back to Germany was received, as only one other attempt to land German agents on American soil was ever made when 2 spies landed on the coast of Maine and were picked up immediately. So what happened to the 2 survivors of the bungled plot? Well, after the war, Dash and Berger had their sentences commuted and were sent back to Germany in 1948. According to Der Spiegel, Berger ended up settling in Bavaria, where he went back to his old trade, that of a toolmaker, and then promptly disappeared from the historical record. Dash, meanwhile, returned to Berlin, and in 1953, an article in Der Stern magazine, likely based on information supplied by Ernest Berger, brandished Dash a turncoat and blamed him for the deaths of the other 6 men on his team. Dash recounted his side of the story in a 1959 book, but the label of traitor would follow him for the rest of his life. He was forced to move regularly until his death in 1991.